There's a news story kicking around at the moment claiming that the McDonald's Corporation is on the edge of bankruptcy or collapse or what have you. Don't believe the hype. The good news is that people in China are more warm-hearted than you might have imagined. People in China are capable of being shocked and refusing to eat at McDonald's because of a documentary they saw on TV. Some footage from slaughterhouses or meat processing plants or both was shown on the TV in China, and apparently a lot of people said, forget it, I don't want to eat at McDonald's anymore, I don't want to eat at Kentucky Fried Chicken anymore. In this video, I'm going to try to talk about a somewhat broader and deeper issue of the profit motive and how it shapes all of our lives, or at least my life in particular. But I have a quick word of thanks to Klaus in the Greenhouse. If it were not for Klaus and his own YouTube channel, I would not be aware of this story. Googling around quickly, I see there's been quite a lot of irresponsible journalism about declining profits from McDonald's, the McDonald's Corporation. Special credit goes to The Guardian, one of England's worst newspapers with the best reputation. The Guardian gets a lot of respect, and they put out a lot of really shoddy and misleading journalism. So The Guardian makes the headline that McDonald's has had a 15% plunge in profits, and they conclude that this is because people all around the world are becoming much more interested in their health, and so the future of the McDonald's Corporation is grim because of rising health consciousness. Yeah, well, a lot of people will read that article and will want to believe it. People will not be skeptical. If you stop and look at the numbers, which is what the journalists over at The Guardian should have done, if they have a background in reading social science statistics, if they have a background in reading economic statistics, what they would find is that the slowdown in global sales for McDonald's is less than 1%. It's 0.9%. Now, you might say, well, that's global, and the globe includes places like China and India, where McDonald's has very visible franchises. What about the numbers in the United States? The United States decline is only 1.7%. Now, if you want to believe that this reflects an explosion of a new attitude towards health consciousness, good luck. The official analysis simply attributes it to better competition. There are some other restaurants in the United States that are more popular than McDonald's right now, and even so, a decline of only 1.7%, although that might be of concern to executives at the McDonald's Corporation to try some kind of rebranding or something, that does not indicate the collapse of the McDonald's brand or corporation in any way. So what has happened, the big news that is concealed in a lot of the Western reporting on this, is that there have been scandals in the production of meat that McDonald's makes use of in China. So there's been a sequence of food safety scandals that have negatively impacted McDonald's. And another chain, fast food chain called Yum Corporation. Yum Corporation is a parent company that owns a number of other brands, including Kentucky Fried Chicken. So South China Morning Post, among other things, is reporting now 48.1% of all of the mainland food processing factories failed to meet acceptable standards. This is from an auditing company that's based in Hong Kong and is paid by the meatpacking industry to go in and inspect factories, slaughterhouses, etc., on their own behalf. So, again, there's this perception versus reality here. There's sort of a strange question of how people construct ethical questions, what assumptions are left unstated. If over 48% of factories are failing these standards, the problem is not that they're failing my standards. The problem is not even that they're failing government standards or international standards or United Nations standards. These are failing standards that are set by members of the same industry who are only motivated by profit. They just want to keep business going. Now, they do want to meet certain professional standards, certain standards of hygiene and safety or what have you, but this has nothing to do with the welfare of animals. There's nothing to do with ecology. There's nothing even to do with the public good. What's best for the greatest number of people in society. It doesn't even have to do with economic efficiency, which is another interesting question to bring to bear on meat production. This is the industry's own set of standards and research being carried out and paid for by the industry itself. So, from that perspective, 48% of these factories are failing. From my perspective, I'm sure 100% of these factories are failing. My perspective doesn't count. However, in Asia, the change has been more dramatic and more interesting. Why? Well, back in 2012, there was a scandal that impacted both Yum Corporation and McDonald's that involved chickens being fed excessive amounts of antibiotics. Now, I'm vegan. I don't buy any of this stuff. I don't eat any of this stuff. I would prefer to see this whole industry abolished, or at least marginalized, greatly reduced in scope. But I can recognize, in terms of the profit motive and the logic of meat production, of what's going on here, that it's completely inevitable that this industry uses more and more antibiotics. You have a system of chickens living in urban densities, something that were never evolved to do. Chickens in nature do not live like bees in a beehive. Disease breaks out amongst the chickens. The owner of the farm wants to make money, so he gives them antibiotics. Maybe that works for a short time, but then it's not working anymore, so he gives them more antibiotics. You can draw up a flowchart. This is not shocking. This is completely predictable. So what's interesting to question is, how is it possible that from the public perspective, from the consumer's perspective, that this is shocking? What was it they assumed? Did they imagine that these chickens were running around freely in a green field with trees? What did they imagine was the situation for these chickens in the industrialized agriculture industry? I don't know. But obviously, the gap here is not between good and evil. The gap is just between perception and reality. Good and evil is another conversation really worth having. But that's not why people in 2012 suddenly decided to stop eating at McDonald's in China. I wish that it were, but it just ain't so. So there's a more recent scandal. 2014, a TV report emerged showing workers picking up meat from a factory floor, as well as mixing meat that had gone past its expiration date with fresh meat. Okay. Completely inevitable. All right, with the same caveats that I'm not making excuses for the meatpacking industry. I just see the logic of, if you're working in a factory where you cut up corpses into pieces, why would you regard a piece of meat falls off the conveyor belt and you pick it up and put it back on the conveyor belt? Why not? For one thing, you have the profit motive. You make more money if you do it. For another thing, you don't necessarily have the delusion that the bacteria on the floor are more harmful than the bacteria that are already found inside the rotting corpse of an animal. An animal's rotting corpse contains blood, contains mucus, contains innumerable bacteria and sources and causes of disease. Also contains poo, for lack of a better word. And, the feces from animals, both passing through the digestive system and that the animals are covered with when they're brought in misery to the slaughterhouse, it is a source of contamination in meat. So, what's amazing to me is that people in China saw a videotape of this and they found it shocking. They thought that this was unacceptable, and they decided in large numbers to stop eating at McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. That this was worse than what they imagined the standards were for slaughterhouses and meat processing plants in China. So what did they imagine? I can remember living in Hong Kong. One of the brands of milk that were on the store shelves there was called Kowloon Dairy. Now, just even that name, Kowloon Dairy, it's as surreal as saying Manhattan Dairy. Kowloon is a very densely populated part of Hong Kong. Every inch of it is covered with concrete, with high-density apartments, with tiny little shops. There is absolutely no room anywhere in Kowloon for cows to be walking freely over green, grassy hills. There's no way you can have this delusion. In Hong Kong, I mean, if you want to know the conditions of those cows and those chickens, you can see it. But evidently, most people buying these things have some set of impossible fantasies about the conditions of meat production. What I just read, it doesn't shock me. If I were making the moral compromise of eating meat at McDonald's in China, which is something I would never do, then the news I just read, I'd say, that's no scandal. Sure, the meat falls on the floor, pick it up off the floor, put it back on the conveyor belt. What do you think? What do you think happens in a factory? What do you think the floor is any dirtier than the corpse they just hacked up and pulled this stuff out of? Give me a break. And look, I mean, the profit motive, it distorts life for us in so many strange ways. And I can remember working in a grocery store back when I graduated from university the first time around. I remember in the grocery store, I got fired because I reported in a totally helpful way, in a totally positive and upbeat way, that the procedure they were following with their coffee, with whole bean coffee, was inevitably resulting in rancid coffee being served to the customers because they just were not separating old and new coffee. So what I was suggesting wouldn't cost them any money, it wouldn't cost them any trouble. It just basically was setting up the drawers of coffee in a way so that you moved forward the older coffee and sold it first and didn't dump in and mix together old and new coffee beans. It was a totally helpful suggestion, and my boss didn't want to hear it, and I was fired from working behind the counter of a grocery store. That's Canada. That's the intensely oppressive hierarchical culture of Toronto, Canada, back when I was a kid. And that grocery store wouldn't make any more money by mixing together rancid coffee with good coffee. If you've got money to make mixing rancid beef with new beef, it's going to happen. My solution is don't eat beef. What do you want me to tell you? Figure it out. What? Yeah. What? So there's good news, there's bad news, and there's indifferent news coming out of this particular flashpoint. This peculiar event that has put some light on McDonald's and where your hamburgers come from, briefly. The good news is that people in China are more warm-hearted than you might have imagined. People in China are capable of being shocked and refusing to eat at McDonald's because of a documentary they saw on TV. Some footage from slaughterhouses or meat processing plants or both was shown on the TV in China, and apparently a lot of people said, forget it, I don't want to eat at McDonald's anymore, I don't want to eat at Kentucky Fried Chicken anymore. I've lived in China, and I've lived around Chinese people all my life. I'm delighted to hear that there is a public there that's still sensitive to those issues and is still responding in those ways. Because believe me, indifference to animal suffering, indifference to human suffering is very real in China. So look, the fact that this is a scandal at all and that it shows up in the economic records at all is good news. It's heartening. The bad news is, look, all of these reports, including the headline from The Guardian, the supposedly respectable Guardian, that McDonald's is teetering on the edge of collapse. McDonald's is facing a short-term crisis in profitability caused by a short-term scandal in China. And the effects of most scandals are indeed short-term. It's very unlikely this is going to change the world for the better. The profit motive and what it does to people, and then what those people do to the environment, is a riddle that is going to be with us forever. And we're always going to be coming up to new solutions for it. Many seemingly convincing social and political philosophies fall apart on this point. I noticed that there are libertarians in this world who have confidence that human beings can operate sewage systems at a profit. Show me an example of a government anywhere in the world that has for-profit corporations running the sewers. Show me an example of a country that has for-profit corporations running prisons. Show me an example of a country that has for-profit corporations running nuclear power plants. All of these things exist. And any sober and detached study of these things is going to find, guess what? There are some forms of business that really cannot be handled by for-profit companies. That was the real lesson of the meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan. There are many lessons to be learned from that example, but the profit motive does not mix very well with the type of public responsibility that is entailed by operating a nuclear power plant. One of the great sources of sadness for me in my life, my professional life, was that I felt I was separating myself from the rat race of, for-profit industries, of the profit motive, by getting involved in things like humanitarian work, charity work, research in third world countries, in Laos and Cambodia, research that was supposed to be making the world a better place. And the sad reality is that, just like inside academia, the profit motive is still haunting you. It's still motivating and warping everything that's going on around you. And you find this again and again. And just as I found back when I was working at that grocery store, or back when I was working at Starbucks as a kid, I found that I was very different from most of the other people around me, that I viewed the moral decisions being made around me in a very fundamentally different way than my colleagues. When I did research in Cambodia, I was doing research to make the world a better place. For example, I did research on the health sector. So I was not doing medical research myself, but I was doing research on how health insurance worked, how the actual health system worked, and we also did evaluations of how the hospitals themselves were performing. That included things like the conditions in the surgery room, whether or not doctors and nurses were washing their hands. Research that does directly and indirectly make a difference. And, my attitude was, I'm being paid enough to do a good job. I'm being paid enough to do something positive. My wage was extremely low. I was not earning enough money to save up and buy an airplane ticket back to Canada, to be quite honest. My very modest wage in Cambodia was enough to survive in Cambodia, however. I was not being paid enough to lie and cheat and steal or harm people. You'd have to pay me a lot more for that. The morality of the job was what motivated me to take the job in the first place and keep the job. And the immorality of the job, the compromises my employer was making, the immoral decisions my employer, that was the reason why I quit that job. But look, there are many different types of people in this world. There are people who will work in a meat processing plant and say, look, you pay me enough to cut up this corpse and make it into ground beef, but you don't pay me enough to poison people. You'd have to pay me more for me to knowingly and intentionally mix together rancid meat with good meat and poison people. You'd have to pay me more for that. It seems that a very small percentage of people feel that way. When I was working at Starbucks as a kid, back during my first year of university, I was amazed that with no profit motive, I had colleagues, same age as myself, sometimes a few years older, who would quite willingly, fake the best before dates on perishable products in the fridge and poison people. That they would serve rancid product instead of fresh product when they had no profit motive. They wouldn't make 1 penny more. They would just be slightly lazier, do slightly less work, do a bad job instead of doing a good job. My moral perspective on that was, no, I get paid enough to pour coffee. I get paid enough to mop the floor, to wash the windows. That's all honest work. Cleaning the toilet is honest work. And you wash your hands before and after. When I had that job, I felt good about doing all that. I wasn't being paid enough to poison people. I wasn't being paid to lie and cheat and steal or to do something I considered immoral. When I was in Cambodia doing that social science research, it was very sad for me to realize that I was the only person on the team who felt like I was being paid enough to do legitimate research, to publish real numbers, real statistics, but not to do fake research, not to publish fake numbers, not to cover up and deceive holes in the research or mislead the client. If you've got a client that's paying you to go out and survey hospitals in Cambodia and discover what's wrong with them so that the Cambodian government and so that international donors, charities, can go into those hospitals and fix the problems so that there can be an intervention to save lives. If instead you're going to take that client's money and lie and cheat and deceive and not do that research, it's not the same as killing people. It's not the same as poisoning people. But as a matter of principle, it's close. And I got to say, for me, in all those lines of work, whether I was doing research on Buddhism, research on the healthcare system, even when I was working in museums, I used to say to people all the time, look, if this were about money, all of us would be in real estate. I mean, none of us are really making money here. If real estate is cutthroat, if people are stabbing each other in the back in the real estate industry, I can understand that. Because people do not, by and large, go into real estate to make the world a better place. They're going into real estate to make money. And this may shock you to learn, but people are not cutting the throats of cows and pigs and chickens in order to make the world a better place. It's about money. But for me, it's with great sadness that I had to realize, even when I was doing NGO work, even when I was doing charity work, even when I was doing research of an historical nature that would seem to in no way be shaped by the profit motive, man, the profit motive was there, haunting me, and changed the behavior of all the other cats around me.